The ring arrived on a Thursday. I remember because Thursdays were my late days at Hargrove Capital, the days as I stayed until the cleaning crew came through and gave me apologetic looks while vacuuming around my desk. Sterling Hargrove ran his legitimate real estate investment firm on a strict schedule, but Thursdays were when the secondary ledgers needed reconciling, the ones that never appeared in the quarterly filings, the ones that explained why the firm's returns consistently beat the market by margins that made our institutional clients stop asking questions. I'd worked for Sterling Hargrove for 5 years, long enough to know which calls to put through immediately and which ones required a very specific kind of discretion, long enough to understand that the man in the corner office with the silver-flecked hair and the quiet authority of someone who'd never once needed to raise his voice was operating in spaces that existed well outside the boundaries of SEC regulations, long enough to recognize that I should have left 2 jobs ago, and that I hadn't, and that the reason lived somewhere I refused to examine too carefully. The package arrived by private courier just after 5. No return address. My name on the label in handwriting I recognized immediately. Cordelia's neat, slanted print. My older sister. I stared at it for longer than made sense. Then I carried it to the break room and opened it alone. Inside, nested in white tissue paper, was an engagement ring. A cushion-cut diamond, simple setting, clearly expensive. There was a note. He proposed last night. Said yes. We're telling everyone Saturday. Please be happy for me. And beneath that, in smaller writing, as though she'd almost not included it, it's Daniel Merritt. The room went very still. I folded the note, put it in my jacket pocket, and returned to my desks. I finished reconciling the Thursday ledgers. I answered 2 emails. I didn't cry, which surprised me, because I'd expected to. Daniel Merritt had been my boyfriend for 2 years before he ended things 18 months ago. He'd said we'd grown apart. He'd been kind about it, which somehow made it worse. 3 weeks after we broke up, he'd started appearing in photographs on my sister's Instagram. By month 2, they were officially together. By month 6, our family had simply rearranged itself around this new reality, the way families do, quietly and without anyone asking whether I was okay with it. I was 29 years old, and my ex-boyfriend was marrying my sister, and I was sitting in a break room at Hargrove Capital, holding a ring I hadn't been given. Sterling's office door opened. He appeared in the hallway, jacket off, sleeves rolled to the forearms, reading something on his phone, with the focused expression he wore when information displeased him. He was 44. Built like someone who'd played college lacrosse, and never entirely stopped, and he had the particular kind of stillness that powerful men sometimes carry. The stillness of someone who doesn't need to perform authority, because it has simply never occurred to anyone to question it. He glanced up and saw me. Then he looked again, more carefully. Calloway. He used my last name the way he always did at the office. My first name, he'd said maybe a dozen times in 5 years, always in moments when the professional distance between us briefly, almost accidentally, collapsed. You're still here, finishing the Thursday reports. He said nothing for a moment. Then, what happened? Nothing happened. You've been standing in that hallway for 4 minutes. Of course he'd noticed. Sterling noticed everything. It was both the quality that made him exceptional at what he did, and the quality that made it difficult to be around him for any length of time without feeling seen in ways you hadn't consented to. My sister got engaged, I said. I'm processing it. Congratulations are in order. Sure. I turned back toward my desk. I'll have the Thursday summary on your desk by 7. Zooey. The full name stopped me. I turned back. He was watching me with an expression I couldn't read, which was unusual. I'd spent 5 years learning to read Sterling Hargrove's face, and I'd gotten fairly good at it. But whatever this was sat outside my catalog. Take the rest of the evening, he said. The Thursday report can wait until morning. That's not necessary. It wasn't a question. I took the rest of the evening. I drove home to my apartment in Midtown and sat on the kitchen floor eating cereal, because I couldn't make myself stand long enough to cook anything real. And I thought about the fact that Daniel Merritt was going to marry my sister, and I was going to have to stand at that wedding and smile and mean it, or at least perform, meaning it convincingly enough that nobody felt they had to ask. The work thing was separate. The Sterling thing was separate. I had always kept those very carefully separate. The engagement dinner was scheduled for the following Saturday, at my parents' house in Westchester. My mother called 4 times in the preceding week to discuss seating arrangements, and whether we should do a buffet or a sit-down, and I said yes to everything. Because the alternative was having a conversation I didn't have the vocabulary for yet. I told no one at the office. Sterling knew something was wrong. He had that quality, the reading room's quality. But he didn't ask again, and I didn't volunteer. We maintained the professional equilibrium we'd spent 5 years constructing, which had the kind of careful load-bearing architecture that collapses the moment you examine it too directly. On the Friday before the dinner, he called me into his office at 4 o'clock. There was a folder on his desk that I recognized. Henderson Realty Group. A deal we'd been structuring for 6 months. The one with the offshore component that required very specific paperwork handled very specifically. "There's a problem," he said. I sat across from him. "What kind?" "The kind where someone talked." His voice was measured, even, in the way that meant he was more concerned than he was letting on. "Federal. Early stage, but they're asking questions. Specifically about the Henderson transaction." I absorbed this. How specific? Specific enough that I need to restructure several things before Monday. He looked at me steadily. "I need you this weekend. I have a family obligation Saturday." "I know." He paused. "I'll need Saturday morning and Sunday. The evening is yours." I thought about my mother's seating chart. I thought about Daniel Merritt standing in my parents' kitchen with his hand on my sister's back. I thought about how much easier it would be to have a reason to be late. "All right," I said. He nodded then. "How are you doing with the engagement?" It wasn't really a question. Sterling rarely asked questions he didn't already have working theories about. "I'm fine." "He's an idiot," Sterling said, and returned to his papers. The observation landed so unexpectedly that I almost laughed. In 5 years, he'd never said anything remotely like that. Never acknowledged that he knew anything about my personal life. Never indicated he'd retained information about Daniel beyond the most cursory professional context. "You don't know anything about him," I said. "I know he had you and chose your sister." He didn't look up. That's enough to establish idiocy. I left his office before either of us could say anything else. Saturday morning I arrived at Hargrove Capital at 8. Sterling was already there, which meant he'd probably been there since 6. We worked through the morning in focused silence, the kind of productive quiet that we'd developed over years of late nights and early mornings, a shared rhythm that didn't require narration. By noon, we'd restructured 3 transactions and moved 2 others into holding patterns that would satisfy a preliminary inquiry without raising additional flags. Sterling ordered lunch in, Thai food, which he knew I preferred to the deli sandwiches he'd eat without complaint. We ate at the conference table, surrounded by documents, and for a while we didn't talk about anything except the work. Then he said, without preamble, "What time is the dinner?" 7. "You should leave by 4. Traffic on the Westchester corridor on a Saturday." He refilled his water glass. "Do you want someone to go with you?" I looked up from my pad thai. "What?" "A buffer." He said it practically, like it was a logistics question. "These situations are easier with a neutral party present. Someone who isn't attached to the family dynamic. You're offering to come to my family's engagement dinner for my ex-boyfriend and my sister. I'm offering you an option." He met my gaze. "Decline it if you'd rather." I should have declined it. There were at least 6 good reasons to decline it, beginning with the fact that bringing my employer to a family dinner was objectively strange, and ending with the fact that the reason I'd never examined too carefully was sitting right across the table from me, watching me with those gray eyes that I'd been carefully not thinking about for the better part of 5 years. "Okay," I said. He nodded. "I'll drive." My mother's reaction when Sterling Hargrove walked through her front door was something I will carry with me for the rest of my life. She shook his hand with the particular warmth she reserved for people she'd immediately decided she approved of, and then she looked at me with an expression that asked approximately 47 questions, none of which she was going to ask in front of him. Cordelia was gracious. She was always gracious. It was one of her genuinely good qualities. She introduced Sterling to Daniel with the careful pleasantness of someone managing a delicate situation. And Daniel shook his hand and said, "Good to meet you," and I watched something move through Daniel's expression. Something he controlled quickly, but not quickly enough. Sterling stayed close to me, not obviously, not in a way that announced itself, but in the way that a person stays close to someone they're paying attention to. When my aunt cornered me near the buffet table and asked in a carrying whisper whether I was all right, because everyone in this family had decided to simply ignore the elephant in the room by periodically asking if I was all right. Sterling appeared beside me with a glass of wine and a conversational redirect so smooth that my aunt walked away 3 minutes later having discussed the housing market without realizing she'd been redirected. "You're good at that," I said quietly. "I've had practice." He handed me the wine. Deflection is a professional skill. Later, Daniel found me on the back porch. I'd stepped outside for air, which was a reasonable and non-suspicious thing to do, and he followed me, which was both unreasonable and very Daniel. "You look good," he said, leaning against the railing. "Thanks. I want you to know, Cor and I, we didn't plan it. It just happened. I know. I just don't want there to be weirdness between us. At family stuff. It's important to me that, Daniel," I turned to look at him. "I came tonight. I'll be at the wedding. You don't have to explain yourself to me." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Is that your boss?" "Yes, you brought your boss. I brought someone." I kept my voice even. "People do that." He looked at me for a long moment, and I recognized the expression. It was the look of someone recalculating, which meant he'd assumed something that the evening was contradicting. I hadn't known until just then how much I needed that. Not for spite. I'd examined that possibility carefully on the drive up and concluded it wasn't primarily about spite, but for the simple, practical dignity of being someone who hadn't been sitting alone in an apartment eating cereal. The back door opened and Sterling stepped out. He looked at Daniel once, briefly, with the polite neutrality of someone who has already made a judgment and doesn't need to announce it. "I'm sorry to interrupt," he said. "Zooey, your mother is looking for you." She wasn't, almost certainly, but I went inside, and Sterling held the door, and I heard Daniel come in behind us, and the evening continued. On the drive home, Sterling was quiet for most of the Westchester Parkway. I watched the dark trees go past and tried to identify what I was feeling, which was more complicated than I'd expected, because the dinner had been less terrible than it should have been, and I wasn't entirely sure what that meant. "Thank you," I said, "for coming." "Of course, you didn't have to do that." "I know." I looked at him. In the dashboard light, his profile was unreadable, which was a thing I'd learned to accept but never quite stopped noticing. "Why did you?" He was quiet long enough that I thought he wasn't going to answer. Then, "Because you've worked for me for 5 years, and this was a hard thing, and I could make it less hard. So I did. It was the right answer. And it was also not the whole answer, and we both knew it, and neither of us said so." The Monday after the dinner, there was a development with the Henderson situation. Sterling spent most of the day on calls I wasn't privy to, which was unusual. Most of his calls, even the sensitive ones, he took in my presence because I was cleared for essentially everything at the level of professional trust that 5 years of keeping your mouth shut will earn you. When he called me into his office at 5, his expression told me what kind of conversation this was going to be before he said a word. "The federal inquiry is moving faster than anticipated," he said. "They're going to want to talk to employees, including me. You're my executive assistant. You have visibility into more than most." He sat back, his hands flat on the desk. "I want to be clear with you about something. Your name is on certain documents that I should not have let you sign. I made a decision years ago that your proximity to this operation was managed in a way that gave you plausible deniability. The documents I let you sign were specifically the ones that don't carry liability." I stared at him. "You organized it that way deliberately." "Yes, for 5 years, yes." Something shifted in my chest, which I would need to examine later, in private, when I could afford to examine it. "You should have told me. Telling you would have required explaining more than I wanted to expose you to. That wasn't your choice to make." He looked at me steadily. "No, it wasn't. And I'm sorry." He said it simply, the way he said most things, without performance, without softening. "I was managing a situation, and I prioritized your protection in a way that bypassed your ability to consent to it. That was wrong, but I'm not liable. You are not liable." He held my gaze. "I need you to know that with absolute certainty. Whatever happens with this inquiry, you walk away clean. I made sure of it. I thought about 5 years of carefully organized documents. 5 years of him assigning me the Henderson signatures, the real estate closings, the legitimate transaction records, and keeping me away from everything else, always with a reason that seemed professional and unremarkable, and apparently was neither of those things. Were you protecting me, I asked slowly, or protecting the operation? Both, he said. But if I'd been forced to choose, it would have been you. The office was very quiet. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, the city was doing its evening thing. Lights coming on, the particular hum of a Manhattan Tuesday resolving into night. I need to think, I said. Take as long as you need. He opened his desk drawer and pushed a business card across to me. Not his usual card, a different one, with a single number and no other information. If you need anything, day or night, this goes directly to someone who can help. I picked it up. You prepared for this. I've been preparing for this for about 3 years. He looked at me steadily, hoping I wouldn't need to. But preparing, I went home. I didn't eat cereal this time. I made eggs, which felt like an achievement, and I sat at my kitchen counter and thought about 5 years of a man who'd been quietly, methodically, without ever once telling me, making sure I would be safe. My attorney, a woman named Patricia Chen, who came highly recommended and asked almost no questions about how I'd ended up in proximity to a federal inquiry without any actual liability, confirmed everything within 2 days. My exposure was minimal. The documents I'd signed were reviewed and cleared. I was going to be asked to speak with investigators, but as a witness, not a subject. Your employer arranged this very carefully, Patricia said, in the tone of someone who found this professionally impressive and personally suspicious. I know. Do you want to talk about whether that's something you're comfortable with? Not today, I said. I went back to the office. Sterling was on a call when I arrived, but he saw me through the glass and held up one finger. 1 minute. And I sat at my desk and answered emails until he appeared in the doorway. You talked to someone, he said. Patricia Chen. Something moved through his expression. Relief, I thought, or the closest thing Sterling Hargrove ever got to visible relief. Good. You organized this very carefully. Yes! For 5 years. Yes! He leaned against the doorframe. I should have told you. I know that. I've been running through the ways I should have handled this differently for approximately 3 years. And telling you is the most significant one. Why didn't you? He was quiet for a moment. Because once I told you, it became something you were consciously carrying. And you were. He paused in a way that was unlike him. Sterling didn't pause. He considered in advance and then spoke when the consideration was complete. You were already dealing with enough. That's not specific. No. He looked at me. It's not. The space between us felt different. I'd worked in this office for 5 years, and I'd learned the particular geometry of it, where to stand, how to move, which silences were professional and which were something else. This was something else, lithe, and I think we both knew it had been something else for longer than either of us had been willing to say. What did you mean? I asked. When you said Daniel was an idiot, he blinked. Exactly what I said. Because he left me, or because he chose my sister? Both. He said it without hesitation. They're not separate things. My throat tightened. Sterling. Zooey. He said my name the way he did when the distance between us briefly, accidentally collapsed. I've been watching you for 5 years. Being brilliant and capable and organized and kind to everyone on this floor, including people who don't deserve it. Being wasted on a man who didn't see what was in front of him. He stopped. You should know that whatever you decide about this job, about whether you stay after everything that's happened, the position is yours if you want it. No obligation, no strings. And if I don't want the job, then I'll write you the best reference letter in New York and make sure you land somewhere that deserves you. That's not what I'm asking. He was very still. I know what you're asking. Then answer it. He crossed the office in a way that was completely unlike him, without measured consideration, without the careful precision he brought to everything, and stopped in front of me close enough that I had to look up to meet his eyes. I don't want you to go, he said quietly. I've spent 5 years not saying that in the approximately 400 ways I've wanted to say it, because you worked for me, and there's a power dynamic that makes that conversation complicated, and because I wasn't certain you'd. He stopped. I'm not good at this. You're good at everything. I'm good at managing situations. This isn't a situation. He reached out, and with the same care he applied to everything, tucked a strand of hair back from my face. You're not a situation, Zoe. You've never been a situation. I had spent 5 years standing in this exact office at various distances from this man, and in all of those 5 years, I had been very careful, very deliberate, very professional about the fact that what I felt was mine to manage, and not his problem, and certainly not something that should complicate the most functional working relationship I'd ever had. I had done that successfully. I had been good at it. I stopped being good at it. I need time, I said. Not because I don't. I stopped. Because there's a lot happening at once, and I need to be sure I'm making the right choice for the right reasons. Take all the time you need. He didn't step back, but he didn't push either. I've been patient. It's a skill I've developed. 5 years of patient, give or take. I went home and sat with it for 3 days. I talked to Patricia, not about legal matters. I walked a lot, through Central Park, down along the High Line, the kind of walking that isn't exercise so much as thinking with your body because your brain keeps running in circles. I thought about Daniel and discovered that what I felt when I thought about him wasn't grief anymore. Maybe it hadn't been for a while, and what I'd been calling grief was actually something simpler, the specific sadness of being chosen over, which isn't the same as being in love. I thought about Sterling. I'd been thinking about Sterling for 5 years and calling it something else, and maybe I should stop doing that. On the 4th day, I went back. He was at his desk when I arrived, in the early morning before anyone else had come in, which was when I'd known he'd be there. He looked up when I appeared in his office doorway, and his expression did something it rarely did. It let me see what was underneath. "You're back," he said. "I didn't go anywhere. You know what I mean." I did. I crossed the office and sat across from him, and we looked at each other in the early light coming through the Manhattan skyline. And I thought about the Thursday my sister's ring arrived, and how the person who'd noticed I was standing in the hallway had been this man, and how he'd noticed it without being told because he'd been paying attention to me since I walked through his door 5 years ago. "I want the job," I said. "For what that's worth, I'm good at it, and I want to keep doing it." He nodded once. "Done. And I want to stop pretending," I said, "that the rest of it isn't there." He held my gaze. "What is the rest of it?" "You know what it is." A slow exhale. Something that wasn't quite a smile but was in the neighborhood. "I've been accused of being hard to read. You're not." "Not to me." I leaned forward slightly. "Tell me what you want, Sterling. Without the management, without the logistics. Just what you want." He was quiet for long enough that I thought maybe I'd miscalculated. Maybe the careful architecture of what I thought I'd seen was actually just the way he treated someone he valued professionally, and I'd been narrating something that wasn't there. Then he said, in the quiet voice he used for things that mattered, "You, for longer than was probably appropriate to want you without saying so. Which I am, again, sorry for. Stop apologizing for the silence. Say something instead." I just did. Say the rest. He met my eyes directly, which he always did but which felt different now, deliberate in a new way. "I want to take you to dinner, a real dinner, not ordering in because we're in the middle of a crisis. I want to have a conversation that isn't about Henderson, or the quarterly filings or the Thursday reports. I want to know what you think about things we've never had occasion to discuss, and I want to tell you things I've been storing up for 5 years because there was no appropriate context for them." He paused. "I want you to not be my employee, technically, while we figure out what this is. Which means the COO position I've been structuring for 18 months, and have been finding excuses not to offer you becomes relevant." I stared at him. "There's a COO position. There has been for a while. Something that was definitely now a smile. I've been waiting for circumstances. You've been waiting for circumstances for 18 months. I've been waiting for several things simultaneously." He opened his desk drawer and pushed a folder across to me. "The title comes with a commensurate compensation adjustment, market rate for someone with your actual level of responsibility, which turns out to be significantly higher than what you've been making." I looked at the folder, then at him. "This is a very calculated way to." "It's not calculated." His voice softened. "It's overdue. You've been doing this work for years. You deserve to be paid for it and titled for it, and recognized for it, regardless of what happens between us personally. The two things are separate, and I need you to know that. What happens if we try this and it doesn't work? Then I'll have been honest with you, he said, and given you a job you're qualified for, and we'll figure out the rest like two adults who respect each other. He held my gaze. But Zooey, I've watched you for 5 years, and I want to be wrong about this, less than I've ever wanted to be wrong about anything. He was not wrong about this. Dinner was the following Friday. Not a business dinner, not ordered in under fluorescent lights, but a real one, at a small Italian place in the West Village, where the owner knew Sterling by name and gave us a corner table without being asked. We talked for 4 hours. We talked about things that had never come up in 5 years of working late, which turned out to be an enormous number of things, and also about things that had come up obliquely, in the gaps between professional conversations, and which now turned out to mean more in context. The federal inquiry resolved in a way that was messy for certain people and not for others. Sterling navigated it, with the same quiet precision he brought to everything. I gave my witness statement and walked out clean, as he'd promised. My sister got married in June. I stood at the wedding and smiled, and by then it was mostly genuine. Because by then what I associated with Daniel Merritt was mostly relief. Relief that the thing we'd had ended when it did and how it did. Because if it hadn't, I might have spent years waiting for something I didn't actually want, and missing something that was already there. My mother adored Sterling. She had, from the dinner in Westchester. She added this to the list of things she felt she'd recognized before I had, which was not entirely inaccurate. Sterling's approach to courtship was, characteristically, deliberate. He did not perform romance. He delivered it, the way he delivered everything, with precision and follow-through. He remembered things I said in passing, and returned to them weeks later. He read a novel I mentioned once and left it on my desk with a post-it note that said only page 84, and page 84 had a passage that said, in 3 sentences, something I'd been trying to articulate for years. He came with me to a family dinner in October, and talked to my father about infrastructure investment for 45 minutes, while I watched from across the room and thought about how 5 years ago I'd walked into a job interview and met someone I hadn't had the language for yet. One evening in November, he asked me to marry him. We were in his apartment, which had become a place I spent most of my time, and it was an ordinary Tuesday, and he didn't make a production of it. He asked the way he said all things that mattered, quietly and directly, looking at me like the answer mattered more than almost anything. I said yes without hesitating, which surprised me only slightly, because when something is true you tend to know it, and this had been true for longer than either of us had admitted out loud. The engagement was followed by the logistical complications that follow any significant life event, when one of the parties has the kind of professional profile Sterling had. There were security considerations, attorneys to involve, a prenuptial conversation that Sterling approached with the same careful transparency he'd brought to every difficult conversation since that day in his office. When he'd told me the truth about the Henderson documents and apologized for making choices that weren't his to make. I didn't sign anything I didn't read. I understood everything I agreed to. He made sure of it. His business partner, a taciturn Scotsman named Hugh, who had worked with Sterling for 20 years and expressed approval through the absence of disapproval, shook my hand at the announcement dinner and said, "About time," and returned to his drink. Sterling translated later. Hugh had apparently been expressing concern about Sterling's judgment for approximately 4 years. I thought about 5 years of Thursday nights and late morning coffee, and the particular quiet of an office, where 2 people are working side by side, and both of them know something is there, and neither of them is saying it. I thought about the ring that arrived in a white package and sent me standing in a hallway until Sterling appeared in a doorway and said, in 4 words, that he'd noticed me. We were married in March, small ceremony, as both of us preferred. My sister was there, and Daniel, and I watched them across the room during the reception, and felt the specific peace of someone who has arrived somewhere they intended to be. "No regrets?" Sterling asked. We were on the small dance floor, the kind of slow-moving dance that has more to do with proximity than rhythm. Not one. I looked up at him. "You? Only that it took this long." He pulled me closer. But we're here now, we were here now. And the Thursday reports would still need reconciling, and there would still be late nights and early mornings and the ongoing work of two people building something complicated together. But when I walked into the office, into my corner office, 3 doors down, with the window I'd mentioned once liking, there was a single white orchid on my desk, which had been there every Monday morning, for as long as I'd worked at Hargrove Capital, which it turned out Sterling had been quietly arranging for 4 of my 5 years there, which I hadn't known until he told me, the same way I hadn't known so many of the things he'd been carrying quietly on my behalf. That, I thought, was enough. More than enough. That was everything.